In his introduction to Struggle with the Demon, Stefan Zweig writes, quote, "Daemonic, this word has had so many connotations imposed upon it, has been so variously interpreted in the course of its wanderings from the days of ancient religious mythology into our own time, that I must explain the sense in which I shall use it in this book. I term daemonic the unrest that is in us all, driving each of us out of himself into the elemental. It seems as if nature had implanted into every mind an inalienable part of the primordial chaos, and as if this part were interminably striving, with tense passion, to rejoin the superhuman, supersensible medium whence it derives. The daemon is the incorporation of that tormenting leaven which impels our being, otherwise quiet and almost inert, toward danger, immoderation, ecstasy, renunciation, and even self-destruction. But in those of common clay, this factor of our composition, which is both precious and perilous, proves comparatively ineffective, is speedily absorbed and consumed. In such persons, only at rare moments, during the crises of puberty, or when through love or the generative impulse, the inward cosmos is heated to a boiling point, does the longing to escape from the familiar groove, to renounce the trite and the commonplace, exert its mysterious ways. At other times, the average man keeps a tight hand on any stirrings of the Faustian impulse, chloroforming it with the dicta of conventional morality, numbing it with work, restraining its wild waters behind the dams of established order. In persons of finer type, however, and above all, in those with strongly productive inclinations, the unrestful element is ever at work, showing itself as dissatisfaction with the daily round, creating that, quote, higher heart which afflicts itself, Dostoevsky, that questioning spirit which expands its yearnings into the abysses of the limitless universe. Whatever strives to transcend the narrower boundaries of self, overleaping immediate personal interests to seek adventures in the dangerous realm of inquiry, is the outcome of the daemonic constituent of our being." End quote. Stefan Zweig's book is a masterclass in bringing the dead to life. His book sketches biographical profiles for three writers that not only conveys the significance of their work and their ideas, but makes you feel at the end as if you really knew these people. They are the poet Friedrich Hölderlin, who lived from 1770 to 1843, the novelist Heinrich von Kleist, 1777 to 1811, and the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, 1844 to 1900. All are active during different points of the Romantic Age, but this is not a survey of an artistic movement. He says that they all lived under the same horoscopic aspect, but he doesn't suggest that their lives run parallel. Ultimately, Zweig compares the three solely on the basis that he thinks each provides an example of a life lived in struggle with one's demon, with the demonic as it manifests within oneself. As he says in the excerpt that we just considered, perhaps all of us encounter the daemonic, perhaps all of us experience the breach into consciousness of this potent yet problematic life force. But for ordinary people, this happens only at the extraordinary times of life. In rare individuals, a daemonic striving drives their entire activity. It supersedes all desire for normalcy, the pull to become part of society, to be part of a family, to measure oneself by the normal standards, live up to the expectations that any sane, responsible person might have. For these daemonic people, the fire burns too hot. Their entire lives are lived as part of this creative firestorm, pushed along by impulses that they can't really understand or challenge. Their greatness, in fact, is in their yielding to the daemonic genius within, letting this spirit of inspiration speak through them as its vessel. And inevitably, as we see in all three of these lives, the demonic flame consumes them, and their fates are insanity, untimely death, and mania, followed by a collapse into dementia. The daemonic man, as seen in these figures, perishes prematurely. While he lives and writes, he displays an almost superhuman power. The demon causes him to live in a state of detachment from the world. The demon isolates him from all that is not the object of its single-minded drive. The longer he lives, the more solitary he becomes, the more estranged from ordinary reality. These were men without families, without steady employment, who didn't build personal empires, but who left behind only a creative legacy. They are untimely, finding no home in their age. Zweig calls them nomads, vagabonds, shadows. He describes them as like shooting stars. Quote, "With no moorings in their own epoch, misunderstood by their generation, they flashed like meteors athwart the night of their mission. They themselves knew not whither they were bound, nor had they any grasp of their significance, as they hurtled towards the infinite in a parabola which seemed scarcely to touch our world of actualities." End quote. And so strangely enough, or perhaps not so strangely, each of these writers utilizes the imagery of fire. They streak across the horizon in a blaze of glory and then crash, pulled towards an inevitable fate. Quote, "They could be spurred to exertion only by impulses from within, by the ardor of their superheated feelings. Fire became their element, flame their mode of activity, and their lives were perpetually scorched in the furnaces which alone made their work possible." End quote. Obviously, Zweig gets his idea of the demonic from Goethe, whom he references in the introduction. But he says interestingly that Goethe is to serve as the counterpoint to these figures. Goethe is uniquely suited to do so, not because he gives us the most powerful conceptualization of the demonic, but because as an artist, he felt the demonic. He had a confrontation with it, and he could have himself been overwhelmed by it. In other words, it would be a rather meaningless comparison to hold up a Nietzsche or a von Kleist against a totally non-demonic man, like, say, an analytical philosopher or someone like that, a person who's purely intellectual or purely pro-social. Goethe is a meaningful point of comparison because he experiences the demonic, but he learns to keep it at a distance. And thus, Zweig argues, the demon holds Hölderlin, von Kleist, and Nietzsche in its thrall, but Goethe learns instead to hold the demon in his thrall. As mentioned in past episodes, Goethe's time of confrontation with the demon has to be the Werther period. As he tells us in his own words, Goethe preserved himself only by writing that book, by letting the demon consume an effigy of himself in the form of Werther. Goethe allows a demonic passion to surge and dominate this fictional character. Eventually, it surges into every corner of his psyche and ultimately destroys him. In the storm and stress of youth, Goethe learned that this great and terrible life force was not only a source of passion, creativity, productivity, but something dangerous if allowed to steer the ship of one's life. Thus, he gains a respect for the demon. The fire within him is allowed to burn, but he keeps to an equilibrium in which it is never snuffed out and never blazes too powerfully. Zweig writes, quote, "The encounter must have been alarming, for throughout life, Goethe retained a fierce respect for, and was inspired with, an unconcealed fear of the powers of his formidable adversary. With the diviner's skill, he recognized his enemy through all disguises, in Beethoven's music, in Kleist's Penthesilea, in Shakespeare's tragedies, which in later years he desisted from reading, quote, 'It would disturb me.' And the more his thoughts and energies were directed into constructive work and concerned with self-preservation, the more sedulous was he to escape every possibility of such, quote, disturbance. He knew what was the upshot when an artist surrendered to the daemon. That was why he was ever on the alert to defend himself, why he warned others against the lion in their path, though his warnings were fruitless." End quote. And further, Zweig continues, quote, "Only in this sense have I contraposed Goethe's figure to those of the thralls of the daemon, those of Hölderlin, Kleist, and Nietzsche, not in the sense of any active rivalry, Though such a rivalry existed in their lives, I needed a great voice of the obverse kind, to make it clear that though I venerate the Bacchic, the hymnic, the titanic, as set forth in my account of the three imaginative writers to whose life and work this book is devoted, I do not regard these qualities as necessarily characteristic of the most valuable or of the sublimest art." End quote. And so each of these demonic men are set apart from the world. They lived lives of solitude. Goethe was a family man. Quote, "He had a wife and children and grandchildren. Women garlanded his life." End quote. These thralls of the demon sacrificed everything in their lives as an offering to the demon. They burned it all up, including wealth, stable residence, social standing. All of this goes into the fire. But Goethe cultivated all of these, and he did so masterfully. Goethe was a part of the world. He was a part of the social life. He was part of the artistic community. He was an active participant. Quote, "He lived in a large, well-appointed house, which he filled by degrees with rarities and art treasures. He was comforted by the warmth of an assured reputation. He had offices and dignities conferred upon him, was a privy councillor, and was styled His Excellency, and on gala occasions orders innumerable glittered on his broad chest." End quote. Even as Goethe stood apart from the beliefs of his time, aloof from the simple division between classical and romantic sensibilities, the way in which he harmonizes those sensibilities and organizes his personality and disciplines himself to wholeness, all of this shows that even as he did not really belong to any movement or any clique, he was willing to enter into life with the assurance that he could always be himself, so to speak. In contrast to these three shooting stars, Goethe lived in a, quote, "fixed orbit," end quote. In some past episodes, I've talked about how some have questioned whether Goethe really is a writer of tragedies. Does Goethe really convey a sense of the tragic through his work? Nietzsche himself posed the question, is Goethe's Faust really the greatest tragic idea that the Germans have produced? A story where the tragedy, quote-unquote, is that Faust seduces a poor young girl and makes her unhappy. He basically ruins her life, and at the end of the first part of the play, she is executed. But Faust gets away with it, so to speak, and in the end, Gretchen is redeemed just as he is. And Nietzsche's criticism of Faust is not limited to the substance of the story. He also attacks its style in an unpublished note from 1873, and actually in this note, Nietzsche has a disparaging word for both Goethe and Herder. Quote, "Goethe could tell fairy tales, Herder was a preacher. Faust is the only national expression of thought in Knittel verse," end quote. Knittel verse literally means cudgel verse. It refers to simple, short, rhyming verses. Often that's the kind of verse you find in like children's stories or limericks. But Goethe uses this form to convey the most serious inner dramas of the soul. Isn't there something farcical about that? Is Faust a tragedy, this work where everything works out in the end for the main character, for whom everything is redeemed, and for whom this daemonic striving ends up bringing him salvation? As Erich Heller put it, Faust is endangered by his striving, he's also saved by striving. Goethe may have provided a wonderful eulogy for his own way of being, and in some sense an apologia for it, but is it really tragic? And thus, some have come to suggest that Goethe never really touched the heart of tragedy. Karl Jaspers wrote that during the period after World War II, in which man had come face to face with atrocities, with the greatest tragedy that had ever befallen the world, Goethe's works no longer seemed appropriate. Quote, "We came face to face with experiences in which we had no inclination to read Goethe, but took up Shakespeare or the Bible or Aeschylus if it was possible to read at all." End quote. Now, the case that Stefan Zweig is making is that it is not so much that Goethe didn't understand the tragic, but that he successfully held the tragic at a distance. He held his self-image firm against the Dionysian power within himself. He experienced it, he recognized it, he respected it, but ultimately he refused to let himself become tragic. And on the other hand, Hölderlin, Kleist, and Nietzsche are all figures of tragedy themselves. Zweig says that their personalities are ideal for the tragic. They enact a, quote, passionate self-surrender to absorption in the elemental, end quote. And so it must be, because the tragic end is the necessary conclusion of the demonic life. The tragic end ties it together like a circle. The demonic yearning connects you to the infinite, in the manner that the Greek daemones connected man to the gods. These demonic men are drawn forth from the finite world of things towards some inkling of the limitless. They seek the impossible rather than the possible. And that's precisely how Goethe described genius. And so we can really comprehend what the demonic means in seeing how Goethe restrained his genius and how they gave into possession by genius. Now, in this episode, we're only going to talk about Stefan Zweig's interpretation of Nietzsche. We're not going to talk about Hölderlin or von Kleist. There are a couple reasons for this. For one, any one of these three sections of Zweig's work could fill an entire episode. Second, this is the Nietzsche podcast, so I think most of you are at least somewhat familiar with Nietzsche's work, but I don't know how familiar the audience is with Hölderlin and von Kleist. And I think it's helpful to have some background in those writers to really connect with Zweig's material on them. But the whole book is really good, so I decided instead that I will cover Hölderlin and von Kleist and Zweig's work on these two, but I'm going to do that all on Patreon. So patrons, you have that to look forward to. We'll move on the main podcast to talk about other things, but I'm going to work on that for the patrons kind of on the side in the near future. But in any case, as a series on the daemonic, we've spent the previous two episodes kind of showing the development of this idea, and I think Nietzsche would be the best person to show how this concept of the demonic plays out in a particular life, and who better to work with to bring this interpretation to bear to than Nietzsche when we've, spent so much time talking about his works and ideas. Before we dive in, a word on Zweig. Zweig himself has something of a demonic life story. He was born in Vienna at the end of the 19th century. He came of age during the elderly years of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I've already said this, I'm pretty sure, many times in the past, but Vienna at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century is just one of those time periods and places that I would love to go if I had a time machine. You could go to a coffee house and end up sitting next to Karl Popper or Godel, go meet Wittgenstein or Stefan Zweig for that matter. And like with many of those figures that I just mentioned, those famous people from Vienna, Zweig was Jewish, and he had to flee Austria after the rise of the Nazis, and that was obviously a terrible and stressful time for him. He lived in England and the United States, and then ultimately settled in Brazil. In spite of all the upheavals in his life, his artistic productivity just throughout his entire life was simply incredible. He had a keen insight into personalities that comes through in his many, many biographies. In addition to this, he's a writer of a large canon of fiction. And unfortunately, another demoniacal aspect of Zweig's life story is that he and his wife met a tragic end. They died of barbiturate overdose in their home in 1942 in Brazil. They were found holding hands. Zweig was 60 years old. He was obviously living in exile, and he was uncertain about the future of Europe. And in his concluding note, his final note to the world, he wrote that he would rather leave existence now in full command of himself, rather than see himself and his condition deteriorate further. Now, I've suggested that Zweig had some of this demonic genius. We could debate as to whether he was of Goethe's type, a man in control of himself, and we could see his end as a final act of self-control, or whether he was one of those enthralled to the demon, sort of on this tragic course in life. Well, I leave that up to you to make your determination about that. Zweig's activity in this book, I would say, is like the act of painting a portrait and not necessarily in the photorealist style. The vibe of the work here is more impressionistic, I would say. He gives us a thoroughly artistic rendering of Nietzsche's life. And speaking as a person who has read the story of Nietzsche's life so many different times and so many different ways told in all these different variations, so much so that it's almost become boring to me to read an account of Nietzsche's life, I never tire of reading Zweig's version because Stefan Zweig is just such a damn good writer. The first description that Zweig gives us of Nietzsche's life is that it is a monodrama. So his life takes the form of a tragic play, and it's a tragedy which is written and acted by only one person. It's a one-man show. And more than that, it's a one-man show that no one attended. His life, like that of von Kleist, is a life of traveling, of rootlessness, and of ultimate solitude. But unlike Kleist, whom Zweig calls the hunted man, someone who always felt as though he were on the run at a breakneck speed, Nietzsche's life is more of a gradual disconnection and unfettering from all of the ties that previously bound him. His family, and the family calling of the pastorship, the university and his self-discovered calling of philology and study of the Greeks, the Wagnerians and their cultural movement of which Nietzsche was once an excited apostle. He abandons it all and goes wandering. He lives in houses which are not his own, as a renter of Spartan rooms that offered little to nothing in the way of luxuries or amenities. It is almost an ascetic existence that is perceptible in Nietzsche's life. And the irony of this was not lost on Nietzsche. He would often suggest that what he shared in common with the religious ascetics was the disconnection from the material world and the joy that he found in solitude. Remember when Zarathustra comes down from the mountain, and the first person he meets is the old priest living in the forest with the animals. This man still praises God. Zarathustra knows as a foregone conclusion that God is dead, and yet they meet each other, they see eye to eye, and they depart from one another, laughing as children laugh. They understand each other. Perhaps you could even venture to guess whether Nietzsche wished to gather for himself some of the power of the ascetic, the moral power to reevaluate values, by practicing the ascetic form of living. Gradually, Nietzsche's friends became shocked and scandalized by the radical ideas expounded in his works. None of Nietzsche's friends really understood Zarathustra, and the follow-up publication, Beyond Good and Evil, is by comparison more straightforward. It's not so drenched in metaphor and allegory, but its publication was probably even less successful than Zarathustra. Along the way, Nietzsche picked up admirers and helpers, people like Georg Brandes and Peter Gast. And he maintained lifelong correspondence and friendship with Franz Overbeck and Jakob Burckhardt. He also lost some friends, people like Lou Salome and Paul Rey, Richard and Cosima Wagner. He doubted whether his lifelong friends Overbeck and Burckhardt really understood him, or if they even wanted to understand his ideas. Zweig writes, quote, "He was left terribly alone upon the stage of his fate. Gradually the solitary actor grew disquieted by the fact that he was talking into the void. He raised his voice, shouted, gesticulated, hoping to find a response even if it were no better than a contradiction. He invented a special music to accompany his words, an intoxicating Dionysian music, but no one heard his minstrelsy. He tried to be blithe and gay, but his mirth was forced and piercing to the ear. He gave his sentences twists and turns, hoping that these antics would attract disciples to listen to his deadly earnest evangel, but not a hand was raised to applaud him. Then he invented a dance betwixt crossed swords, and, stabbed and bleeding, he practiced his new art before a public which had no inkling of what such pleasantries were meant to convey. Nor did any suspect the mortally injured passion that lay concealed beneath his strident levity. Thus the drama was played to a finish before empty seats, and no one guessed that the mightiest tragedy of the 19th century was unrolling itself before men's eyes. Unwitnessed were the last gyrations of his thoughts as they spun upon a dizzy mountain peak, and, with one final and magnificent whirl, tumbled to earth exhausted, dead before immortality." End quote. Nietzsche's path leads him up to the highest mountains, above all of mankind, all epochs, all contingencies and circumstances of life and birth. And as I have often argued, it is somewhat of an oversimplification to say that Nietzsche had no friends or that his life is simply a story of loneliness. But that is the story that Zweig gives us here, and yet I don't find myself quibbling with him over this narrative because of the fact that once again what we have is more of an impressionistic portrait than a photoreal portrait. Zweig wishes to convey to us the power of the daemonic to push one beyond the finite world in pursuit of the limitless. Nietzsche's attempt to pursue the truth, to understand the value of truth and the truth of values, to understand, therefore, the story undergirding all of the greatest figures and developments in the history of mankind and mankind's ideas. Just as in the Dionysian tragedies, the central figure is always truly a variation on Dionysus, who is ripped apart by the Titans, Nietzsche attempts to portray the deep drama underlying all human existence. It's not the story of a divine hand of providence that guides human events, nor of sovereign human wills even making free and autonomous decisions, nor is it simply random events with no meaning. He sees it as a dramatic unfolding of the contestation between values. This world is a story of those who legislate values, those who take hold of human destiny. It's a story of the conflicting impulses beneath values. And it is precisely because Nietzsche takes himself up 6,000 feet above man and time that he can attain the bird's eye perspective and see the whole picture. Remember how Eckermann spoke of the layman standing before the artwork of a master painter. It's because we are all the laymen before the great canvas of reality that none of us really perceive the connection of the whole to the parts and the parts to the whole. It's kind of a fool's errand to attempt to take up the perspective of the master painter in respect to this great canvas of reality. It's an attempt to do the impossible. But that is precisely what the demonic does. It pushes us from the possible to the impossible, and as a result, it always ends in tragedy. And this is certainly the case with Nietzsche. But in ascending to the highest peaks, he finds that he has no peers to stand with him. Instead, he finds himself imagining future peers, wishing for other philosophers who will join in the task in the distant future. Zweig authors one of my favorite images of the daily life of Nietzsche from the time when he became a wanderer on the face of the earth, the period of Nietzsche's serious philosophizing after departing from the university at Basel and departing from the Wagnerianism at Bayreuth. Quoting here from Zweig in an abridged form, quote, "To obtain a real likeness of the man, we need to see him in his actual surroundings. What were they? A dining room in some modest boarding house, quarters in an equally modest hotel among the Swiss mountains or on the Italian Riviera, insignificant fellow boarders for the most part, elderly females, experts in small talk. A gong sounded for the third time and the guests filed in to dinner. One of them was a slouching figure, peering before him as if he had just emerged from a dark cave. For Nietzsche, who was, quote, 6/7 blind, always groped his way when entering a room. His clothes were dark of hue and carefully brushed. His face was gloomy and crowned with a mane of brown hair. His eyes, too, looked melancholy behind the thick lenses of his spectacles. He would bow courteously to his fellow guests, wishing them politely good day, and in return his fellow guests would with equally polite indifference greet, quote, the German professor. He would examine every dish, asking whether the tea was not perhaps too strong, the food too highly spiced, for an error in diet might cause him days of racking pain. He would retire to his room. The table was usually littered with sheets of manuscript, with jottings on scraps of paper, with proofs. Not a flower, not an ornament, hardly a book, seldom a letter would be found. Away in a corner was a heavy and clumsily made wooden trunk, his only possession in addition to a change of underlinen and a second suit. On a shelf were ranged innumerable bottles of tinctures of this, that, and the other medicament, to cure headache, to which he was a martyr, colic, spasmodic vomiting, constipation. More numerous than any other drug in his pharmacopoeia were chloral and veronal, those terrible specifics against insomnia. A ghastly collection of poisons, the only resources he had to fall back upon in case of need in the dreary silence of his lair, where he knew no other kind of repose than the brief interval of artificially produced sleep." End quote. So, a very evocative portrait, and in many ways a very sad portrait. And I have very little commentary to add on this particular passage, other than to say I think it succeeds in Zweig's aims of giving us a, quote, real likeness of the man. Not simply to describe him in general terms, but place him in a particular setting, the kind of setting that he would normally inhabit, and give us to imagine, his daily routine and the room he retires to and the poisons he has to rely upon in his struggle for health. That struggle, the struggle for health and the tension between health and sickness, is another key aspect of Nietzsche's life and his philosophy. In fact, I would contend, as many others have, that the tension between health and illness is what unifies Nietzsche's life and philosophy. So much about Nietzsche can be understood through this element, the monstrous suffering that characterized his entire life. It placed him always on guard, in the way that Zweig describes him carefully determining what kind of food to eat, eschewing alcohol and cigarettes, often eschewing any kind of anesthetic or means of numbing the pain. Now, of course, as Zweig mentions, he took many different kinds of drugs, but these were each specific remedies for conditions that he had. And the only things that you could really call something that, would sort of numb Nietzsche or take away his consciousness would be the aids that he used to sleep. But even these, he took chloral hydrate in order to sleep. That could have been the cause of hallucinations. And there are ways in which Nietzsche medicating himself could have profoundly affected his experience of reality and thus his worldview. Many have written on this. But I think what's clear is that this all relates to Nietzsche's spirit of experimentation, that first and foremost he experimented with himself. He experimented with what foods made him feel healthy or lively and rejuvenated, what made him feel ill or heavy or unable to digest. There's lots of digestion metaphors in Nietzsche's work. He also experimented with his environment and with his climate. He tried to find the proper place for his physiology. Zweig writes, quote, "I doubt if there ever has been a man so sensitive as Nietzsche to atmospheric alterations, one who so minutely responded to meteorological tensions and oscillations. His whole body was like quicksilver, like a barometer. An intimate relationship existed between his pulse and the atmospheric pressure, between his nerves and the degree of humidity in the air. An electric current seemed to flow from him outward and from the universe back to him. Every few feet of altitude was registered within him as on an aneroid. Every oscillation of temperature announced itself by a succession of pain and suffering within his body, which reacted promptly to each jolt of nature." End quote. So in Nietzsche, there's this connection between inner and outer that's felt more immediately than most of us feel it. This connection between nerves and environment. Nietzsche is a human aneroid. He's a human barometer. He's able to measure the apparently external world by the way it resonates in his sensations. There's a correlation between what one takes in, what one absorbs into their organism, and one's health. Nietzsche's attention to diet comes out in this. Also, there's a connection between the inner physiological state and the conscious thought pattern. And this is really important insofar as Nietzsche sort of interrogates the origin of thoughts. He says, for instance, he trusts no thought that he has while he's sitting still, and that when he thinks best is when he's walking at a brisk pace. His joy in life is his exercise, hiking in the Swiss Alps. And it is in those moments in which Nietzsche feels alive, he feels healthy and potent, and he can trust his thoughts in those moments. And so Nietzsche's experience with health and sickness and his experience with the way that his body reacts to stimuli leads him to understand his thought as springing from a physiological origin. In Beyond Good and Evil, remember where he says the most abstruse metaphysical philosophy has a physiological origin. It has an origin in the impulses. He says that we ought not to separate the will from thinking, which would represent a castration of the intellect. And so much of Nietzsche's philosophy is based on this idea of sifting out the thoughts of morbid origin from the thoughts of a healthy origin. And Zweig points out, as Pierre Klosowski also did in his book on Nietzsche, that there were times when the suffering was too much, that Nietzsche even entertained thoughts of self-termination, we might say. Zweig describes Nietzsche as a martyr to his headaches and quotes from a letter in which Nietzsche confesses, quote, "This terrible and unceasing martyrdom makes me yearn for the end," end quote. Or in another place where Nietzsche says that a pistol is now the source of relatively pleasant thoughts for him. So in no way should we trivialize the degree to which Nietzsche was tormented by his ill health. It was a lifelong struggle, and, there were better and worse times for him, better and worse periods of his life, often discovered through experimentation. But the pain is never entirely absent. The threat of it is ever present, might be another way to put it. And yet, what does Nietzsche say about his health in his autobiographical work Ecce Homo? Quote, "In total, I have enjoyed good health," end quote. The way that Nietzsche describes this in Ecce Homo, which Zweig summarizes, is that he contains within his physiology both his illness and the means for continually overcoming it. He's both things at once. He's the cross on which he is martyred, the lifelong condition that is within him. He's also the strong nervous system, the will to resist, the mind that can continue its productivity in spite of the suffering, or indeed can even learn to use the suffering as a kind of fuel for itself. Zweig writes, quote, "Both his temperament and his body, both his mental and physical equipment were sound, but his sensitiveness made him unable to cope with the violence of his feelings, so that his nerves were constantly in revolt. Yet this revolt was never able to shake the man's iron command over his intellectual activities. Nietzsche found an apt way of describing his condition on the borderline between safety and danger when he wrote of his sufferings as, quote, the pepperings of musketry fire. The besieging armies of aches and pains never breached the walls of his citadel," end quote. So Zweig, far from seeing Nietzsche's thought as produced by his condition, Zweig suggests we should see his thought as that beloved activity, that enlivening activity that for Nietzsche was always beyond the reach of his revolting nerves. He safeguards his mind by taking on the role of his own doctor, his own diagnostician, which was something that Nietzsche felt he had a genius for. He experiments on everything in his life. In some sense, he is connected to nature through himself, through his physiology. He is connected to the entirety of history through the experience of his own thoughts, the examination of their genealogies, their origins. For if he can identify whether a thought is morbid or healthy within himself, presumably he can use this criterion to interrogate thoughts, philosophical, religious thoughts from throughout history and understand the values undergirding them and therefore understand what they are symptoms of. But this insight comes at a cost. This self-treatment, in a way, serves to further isolate Nietzsche, because as Zweig says, it drove him into a, quote, morbid state of solipsism. Self-vivisection naturally made things worse, end quote. The fact that inside and outside collapse in the experience of this human barometer, Nietzsche, this human altimeter, the fact that his life is devoted to attending to the conditions of his own existence in order to find that perfect equilibrium, it only makes him more solitary. Zweig continues, quote, "But Nietzsche was a battlefield of contradictions. Goethe in his wisdom knew how to steer clear of danger, but Nietzsche audaciously went forth to meet danger, to take the bull by the horns. Though psychological study and intellectuality are prone to sweep an impressionable man into an abyss of suffering and despair, they are also capable of bringing him back to health and sanity. Nietzsche was gifted with a genius for self-analysis, and just as his ailments were mainly due to this gift, so by it he was once again made whole. Thus, psychology in this instance became therapeutics, became a marvelous application of that alchemist's art, which boasts of being able to extract value from something which contains no value at all. End quote. So, once again, the comparison to Goethe is helpful here. Faust's soul is endangered by striving, it is saved by striving. So, too, Nietzsche is endangered by his psychological self-vivisection, but ultimately he's brought to life and health again through it. Are the two men comparable, though? Well, the important difference is in Nietzsche's embrace of danger, the fact that he exhorts us to live dangerously, to go under, to perish in the pursuit of the great and impossible, throw yourself precisely into the place of the greatest danger, and thus to win eternal liveliness, and not eternal life. Nietzsche directly counterposes those two things, that his goal is eternal liveliness, not eternal life. Goethe recognizes the demonic as a source of danger, and he acts accordingly and prudently. His Faust does not meet a tragic end. He is rewarded with eternal life. Nietzsche, on the other hand, recognizes the demonic as a source of danger too, but he says, "Hail demons, live dangerously." It is precisely in the metaphysical danger posed by his illness, this life of martyrdom, seemingly absurd and meaningless suffering, that Nietzsche finds the riposte to all these metaphysical views of life. Because, after all, one who suffers continuously, suffers greatly, that kind of person would seem the most liable of all to throw himself into a metaphysical view of the world, right? A view that offers comfort and gives meaning to the whole thing by redeeming the world with a superordinate, supersensible world, or moral telos for reality. And this is part of why there is this connection, this parallel between Nietzsche and the ascetics. He grapples in solitude with suffering just as they do. And like the ascetics, Nietzsche separates himself from the world, at least from the ordinary finite world of people and things and events, this timely world of current events, the latest news, countless little dramas and petty ambitions and tiresome love triangles and everything that characterizes this mundane human drama that's experienced everywhere. Nietzsche's climbing up to see from the sort of bird's eye perspective to try and understand the whole picture, this whole contestation of values on the grand scale, that takes him up beyond this. But really importantly, Nietzsche takes the energy created by his suffering and, as we've said, uses it to fuel his project. He doesn't deny the world as the ascetic does, even as he sets himself apart from it. He uses his suffering to propel himself into this world of thought that is able to pose those diagnostic questions, the psychological questions, the questions of genealogy, and the methods of experimentation. Nietzsche brings all of this into philosophy. He takes this view from on a height, and he begins to enjoy this sort of sober, cold, free view of human affairs, even as he argues that no fleshless fantasies must be indulged. In fact, his pursuit of truth leads him right back into the flesh. His intellect has to penetrate the physiology in order for it to really answer the questions that Nietzsche is interested in. And thus, in terms of his values, he becomes quite the opposite of the ascetic. Nietzsche's illness and his way of dealing with it is what keeps him from being ensnared in what Nietzsche called gardens of Armida, which is an idea that Nietzsche gets from Tasso. It's a kind of enchanting, diversionary, beautiful place in which the hero can rest and yet forget his quest and forget his calling. Zweig writes, quote, "Whenever he had tried to settle down, to lead an easy life, to grow fat and flabby, whenever he ran the risk of losing his originality by prematurely becoming petrified in an official post, a profession, a special form of intellectual activity, illness had goaded him from his refuge. Ill health prevented him from being enrolled in the army, and he was thus enabled to continue his scientific studies. To ill health again, he owed it that he did not fall into a rut but was plucked away from science, from the university circle at Basel, and thrust out into a larger world, the world of his own being. Through his afflicted eyes, he was protected from enslavement to books. Quote, one of the greatest services I owe to myself, end quote. Every tie that threatened to be imposed on him was severed by suffering, a cruel but necessary operation. Illness itself frees me, he wrote. Illness was the midwife that brought his inner man into the world, and the pains he experienced were labor pains. Thanks to illness, life never became a routine, but remained a perpetual regeneration, an adventure, a discovery. Quote, I discovered life as something new, myself included, end quote. One of the ways that Zweig describes Nietzsche is as the Don Juan of the intellectual world. Like Don Juan, Nietzsche devotes his life to seduction. He openly describes his philosophy as a kind of temptation. Another image that Zweig gives us is the image of the pirate or the filibuster. The term filibuster, which we use in modern-day America to refer to a certain legislative maneuver, it originally comes from the Spanish word for pirate, filibustero. These were what we might have called privateers in English. But privateers who began to go on unauthorized missions and raids. The filibusteros were essentially adventurers. They lived and acted beyond the sanction of the law. They went around fomenting civil wars and revolutions, and they plundered and sailed and wandered according to their own will, having disregarded the authority of the Spanish crown. So Nietzsche's philosophy is a kind of lawless adventure. As Nietzsche himself described it in Ecce Homo, philosophy for him is a kind of wandering in forbidden country. And perhaps, most importantly for Zweig, this attitude towards life and thought turns Nietzsche's work in an entirely different direction from pretty much the aims or the direction of every other German rationalist or idealist philosopher. Nietzsche doesn't attempt to build a system. And in fact, he seems to have disdain for systems. If Kant and Hegel and Schelling were like the founders of empires, who attempted to raise cathedrals of thought from the foundations of the most indubitable axioms and propositions, Nietzsche is more like the pirate captain. He sails by these new empires, he sizes them up, and then he launches his attack, he launches his raid. He founds no new states, he only sails by and foments revolution. He just plunders and goes on adventures and then moves on. Whereas these other philosophers wanted to establish something enduring and eternal, Nietzsche shows us that the point is liveliness, vitality. This is what he displays in his activity, in his vigor. But he leaves behind him only fire and destruction. Quote, for the first time on the ocean of German philosophy, the black flag was hoisted upon a pirate ship, end quote. And Zweig quotes from one of the Dionysian dithyrambs and calls it Nietzsche's pirate song that he sings as he sails off into the uncertain with his sword in hand and powder barrel at his feet. Quote, I know from whence I spring, insatiable as a flame, I glow and consume myself. All I touch flashes into fire. All I leave is a charred remnant. Such by nature am I, flame. End quote. It is accordingly in the following chapters that Zweig portrays Nietzsche as a man on a personal quest for sincerity. The kind of person who can write that convictions have to be utilized, that they are eventually consumed by the philosopher. They're eventually consumed perhaps by his demonic fire. Nietzsche, another way to put it, or another image, Nietzsche sheds his convictions like shedding skin in the manner of a snake. So long as the snake is alive and healthy and moving, it continues to grow new skins and shed the old. I mean, you might say that the snake doesn't ever, its goal is not to get to its final skin, right? Its final skin is simply the one it possesses when it dies. And so Zweig says, it's not Nietzsche's intention to reach a final conviction, a final doctrine, and therefore it is not Zweig's intention to lay out Nietzsche's doctrines in the manner of a schoolmaster who will, present Nietzsche's theory of epistemology and then his moral positions, or however, you might do it. In some sense, this enumeration of doctrine and the systematizing of Nietzsche is always a disservice to him. Now, for my part, I've done a fair bit of presenting Nietzsche systematically or as a schoolmaster, I'm sure many would argue, because I think this is a way to seriously engage with his philosophy. And really any philosopher's statements, you should, if you want to take them seriously and try to understand them, I think it behooves you to try to connect them and correlate them together, see what conclusions are reached, and sort of looking at it all in concert as from the big picture and trying to interpret it that way. But true to Zweig's sentiments, I've also tried to present Nietzsche from different angles at different times, and to present him as a discontinuous personality. He has different phases of thought, different impulses that speak through him at different times, and I think Nietzsche's philosophy demands this approach. He doesn't want us to harmonize or synthesize, smooth over contradictions in thought. In fact, I think Nietzsche demands that any approach to philosophy, any conception of it, has to include the possibility for contradiction, for the play of self-contradictions, and the intermixture of apparently opposite and incommensurate elements. I mean, any philosophical account which sort of slackens the tension of the bowstring is anathema to Nietzsche's approach. If we were to come up with yet another image, yet another metaphor, we could say Nietzsche is a kind of nomadic figure, as Zweig calls him. This description of Nietzsche as nomad, of nomadism as a kind of philosophical temperament, well, for one, it long predates the Deleuzian conception of the nomad. Zweig's book came out in 1925, after all. Zweig says Nietzsche's authoritative sayings scare the scholars and make them wish to shut him away. Others wish to place this, quote, temperamental nomad, end quote, on a pedestal and lock him in a temple to, sort of designate a certain fixed understanding of him. But in Zweig's view, Nietzsche can't be pigeonholed into one philosophical conception. Quote, each of Nietzsche's convictions formed a period of transition. Even his proper self, his skin, his body, his mental equipment were never more in his eyes than a multiplicity, a, quote, meeting place for numerous souls, end quote. So the conviction is never, again, the goal, it's never the final resting place, it's a step in a movement. Nietzsche is always in a state of transformation, quote, ceaselessly losing himself and finding himself anew, end quote. Once again, we return to a comparison to Goethe. It becomes relevant here. Quote, Nietzsche's favorite metaphor concerning the snake sloughing its skin was used a century earlier in one of Goethe's letters. But what a contrast between Goethe's deliberate evolution and Nietzsche's eruptive metamorphoses. Goethe's life expanded around a fixed point, just as year by year a circle invisible to the outer world is added to the trunk of a tree. The tree may shed its bark, but the core is sound, the limbs are strong, its growth is ever more lofty, its view increasingly wide. Patiently, thanks to an active though stubborn concentration of his energies, Goethe attained his maturity. He resolutely guarded his ego while defending his proper growth. Nietzsche's development, on the other hand, was spasmodic and violent, owing to the impetuosity of his will. Goethe's enlargement was effected at no sacrifice of his true being. He was never called to deny himself in order to rise to higher things. Nietzsche, the changeable, was perpetually obliged to destroy himself, that he might reconstruct himself wholly. His spiritual gains, his fresh discoveries, were the result of self-inflicted tortures, of lost faiths, of decomposition. If he wished to attain to more exalted peaks, he was constrained to discard a part of himself, whereas Goethe sacrificed nothing, merely transforming and distilling his individual elements. End quote. To return to the imagery of fire and incendiaries, Nietzsche's transformations could also be viewed as a sequence of detonations of his previous faiths, the detonations of the temples where he once venerated, and the images and statuary that he used to represent himself formerly. For Nietzsche, each thought is like forked lightning, and accordingly he writes of being struck by ideas as if by lightning. And sometimes those lightning strikes just simply blow up one of the things that Nietzsche used to think was solid and fixed and something that he could sort of stand by or something like that in a past state of mind or a past conviction, something like this. He even writes that such ideas bring forth what he calls expansions of feeling or even explosions of feeling. Quote, "It has often occurred to me that I shall suddenly die during one of these explosions," end quote. And so, it's not for nothing that Nietzsche once said, "I am dynamite," or that he described his maxims in Twilight of Idols as akin to missiles. Or, there was the way that Peter Gast, he had a very sort of approving reception of the Twilight of the Idols, and he says that Nietzsche has set up his artillery guns on the highest peak possible in order to rain down his explosive ideas on the world. Another contrast with Goethe is that Goethe grows and develops and transforms, as Zweig says, along a regular, steady course of evolution, rather than these explosive growth spurts. And in Goethe's case, his development follows what we might call the quote, normal course of life. Goethe, when he is young, is gripped with fiery passion. It's here that he really faces the demonic. As he grows older, his thought grows more orderly. As Zweig says, quote, "His mental rhythm corresponded in every point with the temperature of the blood," end quote. So, we're all hot-blooded in youth, and therefore hot-headed and driven by superheated feelings, but we cool as we get older. Not just from the normal course of aging, we might say sort of like your energy declines, but you could argue it comes from self-development, from learning how to order your chaotic feelings, master them as Goethe attempted to do. This is Zweig writing about Goethe once again, quote, "After going through a revolutionary period, he turned conservative. After a phase of lyricism, he became a man of science. After being prodigal of himself, he learned how to be reserved," end quote. But what is the case with Nietzsche? It would seem that his manner of transformation, this series of detonations, is just as unusual as the direction in which his transformations proceed. After all, we all know that Nietzsche's ideal, which is a word I would put in scare quotes because he's generally opposed to the idea of having ideals. We'll use it provisionally, right? Nietzsche's ideal is the child. That's the final metamorphosis of the spirit, a further development from the negative activity of the lion. And so he sort of honors Ion, the boy god of the zodiac, hearkening back to the aphorism of Heraclitus that the kingly power is the child's, time itself is a child playing draughts. Let us look to the phases of Nietzsche's life then and see how the course of his development almost appears as the opposite of the normal course, which is followed by Goethe. Quote, "As he advanced in years, he became increasingly impatient, vehement, revolutionary, and chaotic. His outward aspect was in strident opposition to the customary evolution of a man. While his university companions were still delighting in the usual horseplay of undergraduates, Nietzsche, though but 24 years old, was already a professor, aspirant to the chair of philology at Basel, that famous seat of learning. At 24, Nietzsche's intimates were men of 50 and 60 years of age, sages such as Jakob Burckhardt and Ritschl, while his closest friend was the most celebrated artist of the day, Richard Wagner. He deliberately put the brake upon his poetical aspirations and upon his love of music," end quote. Further in the text, Zweig continues describing the period when Nietzsche left university. Quote, "Having precipitately left from philology to music, from gravity to ecstasy, he passed from scientific patience to the joyful dance. By the time he had reached his 36th year, Nietzsche had become an outlaw, an amoralist, a skeptic, a poet, a musician. He had regained a better youth than had been his lot in earlier days, had thrown off the shackles which bound him to the past, had freed himself from his own science, refusing to allow the present to put claims upon him. Thus, instead of years of development serving to stabilize his life, making it systematic and serious in tone, they liberated Nietzsche more and more. Such a course of rejuvenation is almost unprecedented. Having reached his 4th decade, Nietzsche's language and his thoughts, his whole being, indeed possess a freshness, a color, a fearlessness, a passion, and a music he had never known as a lad of 17." End quote. A surprising claim, in a way. Nietzsche seems to age in reverse, not physiologically, but in terms of his sentimentality, in terms of the tenor of his ideas, in terms of the enthusiasm. Indeed, perhaps because of his dawning mania, his euphoric state in which he ends his lucidity at Turin, the final works of Nietzsche in 1888, they're certainly more energetic and more vigorous. I mean, people have suggested these final works are, a bit insane or a bit unhinged and going too far in a few places. It's hard to argue that Zweig isn't right about this. Nietzsche is more unequivocal in his final work. The structure of some of these books, like Twilight of Idols or Ecce Homo, are a bit novel. He's taking risks. He's trying new things. He advances the most caustic argument against Christianity yet in the Antichrist, and that's relative to the career of a man who spent an entire career attacking Christianity, basically. And meanwhile, if we go back to the tone of a book like Human All Too Human, the first serious, full philosophy book by Nietzsche, this is a book with a dedication to Voltaire, and more in the style of the French rationalists and aphorists. It's more of a cool-headed book. It's a book that tries to obtain sobriety of perspective through a certain dispassion. By the end of Nietzsche's career, he has totally repudiated dispassionate philosophy altogether. He would repudiate even the concept that it's possible to do dispassionate philosophy. He has embraced the role of the pirate, the filibuster, the commander of the artillery regiment. And somehow Nietzsche gets older, but his sensibilities and his energy gets younger. And that's mirrored in his philosophy, as I mentioned. The image of the child is the final metamorphosis. The child is the very god of time. So there's like this push towards innocence and liveliness, as Nietzsche's moral revaluation would almost seem to make this a requirement, that his life and philosophy move backward to a more youthful perspective on life. For Zweig, a watershed moment in Nietzsche's life, and another fascinating point of comparison with Goethe, is Nietzsche's discovery of the South. Anyone who has read a wide swath of Nietzsche's works will know how he talks about the Mediterranean climates and the cultures they produce, and talks about how the people are more lively and brisk and free in their temperament. And he contrasts the people of the Mediterranean climes with everything cold and Germanic and Nordic, the rigid coherence sought by the Lutheran culture, the slowness and stubbornness and the pig-headedness of the Germans. And this dichotomy for Nietzsche goes all the way back to the history of the Renaissance and the Reformation. The Renaissance, which begins in Italy and flourishes in France, was a reawakening of the aesthetics and the morality of antiquity. Luther's Reformation he describes as the reaction of those who were by no means tired of medieval views of the world, and who were the most zealously moral at a time when the Church was at its most immoral. The Reformation conquers the Catholic Church in Nietzsche's view, because it brings about a siege mentality. In so many words, the Catholic Church is made to aspire to the doctrinal consistency and religious dogmatism demanded by Luther, making his theological revolution a great success. Nietzsche accordingly says that every crime against culture in the past centuries lies on Germany's conscience. He wonders perhaps if the culture of Europe, which had developed this magnificent inner tension, containing both the otherworldly moral demands of Christianity and the freedom of paganism, the vitality of paganism, if it only needed one more night to mature and bear fruit. But then the Reformation came in the form of a storm that destroyed the potential of the harvest, the potential for a true rebirth of the Dionysian feeling in Europe. For Zweig, the discovery of the South is to be understood as part of Nietzsche's flight from academia and his life of wandering. He begins to travel through the Mediterranean parts of Europe after leaving Basel, visiting Nice, Genoa, Bergamo. He summers in the Swiss Alps and spends his winters in Italy. This is the period in which he breaks out of his professorial chrysalis as Zweig calls it, and is allowed to give his demonic spirit free rein. The journey south remained the, quote, parent metamorphosis, end quote, that defined the direction of future transformations. Quoting here in an abridged form, quote, in Goethe's career too, a trip to Italy was a turning point. He likewise sped southwards in order to discover his true self, to pass from bondage to liberty, from a vegetative existence into a world of creative experience. And Goethe, too, when for the first time he crossed the Alps and beheld the splendor of the Italian sun, a change took place with eruptive violence. I feel as if I had just returned from an expedition to Greenland, he wrote. He, too, was made ill by the gray skies of a German winter. He, too, with his sunny nature and his craving for light and clarity, felt as though an inner spring of emotion had been tapped and was now bubbling up to the surface of his being. He felt expanded and freed. He felt the need for a new and more personal liberty. But, unhappily for Goethe, the South revealed itself too late. His first journey to Italy took place when he was approaching 40. A hard rind had formed around his character, which was essentially of a methodical and reflective kind. A part of his being, of his thought, had remained in Weimar, was lingering around his home, the court, his dignities, his functions. He was not a man to permit of outside forces mastering him. Goethe always wished to be a ruler of his own destiny. Nietzsche, Hölderlin, and von Kleist, on the other hand, were spendthrifts and gave themselves up, heart and soul, to every impression, happy when the new experience hurled them back into the scalding waters of the river of life. In Italy, Goethe found what he was in search of, and little else. He sought profounder interconnections, where Nietzsche sought higher freedom. He evoked the glorious memories of the past, where Nietzsche looked toward a glorious future. He was concerned with things dead and buried. Classical art, the Roman spirit, the mysteries of plant and stone, whilst Nietzsche's gaze was aloft, his eyes delighting in the sapphire skies, in the clear and infinite horizons, in the magical sensation of this luminosity flooding him through every pore. Goethe's impression of Italy was therefore a mental and aesthetic affair, whereas Nietzsche's was vital in the extreme. The former brought home with him an artistic style, whereas the latter discovered in the land of the sun a style of life. Goethe was merely fecundated, whereas Nietzsche was completely uprooted, transplanted, renewed. End quote. What is the meaning of the differing experience of the South in these two writers? Again, we have to acknowledge what is so similar in their experience, where their lives do appear to run parallel in order to perceive the fundamental dichotomy between them. Goethe always remains centered, bound to his identity, an identity that he has rigorously and artistically crafted. In other words, he remains German and he remains Goethe, whereas Nietzsche allows himself to be transplanted. And in this, he transcends Germany the moment he discovers the South. He learns that he belongs somewhere else, other than his native land. And that's a very odd thing to realize, but with this realization, it brings with it a series of consequences. This brings about Nietzsche's association of himself with the figure of the wanderer. It comes with a newfound concern with Europe rather than Germany. From here on out, Nietzsche is the good European. His heroes are good Europeans. His heroes are those whose interests transcended national boundaries and whose talents were directed at a wider world than the, quote, parochial interests of the fatherland, end quote. In the South, Nietzsche finds a greater clarity. He feels enlivened by the sunlight and the freshness of the air. And whereas other intellectuals like Goethe go there to experience the past and perhaps take something from that experience of the past that might sort of add to their artistic toolkit or something like that, Nietzsche has a whole other experience of living. As Zweig says, he takes a whole new way of life from the South. He's less inclined to marvel over those Roman ruins than he is to take in the sky and the vast coastline. We have to remember, therefore, that this newfound feeling of warmth and freedom that Nietzsche discovers in the South is inseparable from his physiological experience of being in the world. This human barometer finds the South most congenial to the state of his body. And he's already learned from his past experiences that the state of his body is inseparable from the state of his mind. It's only in the body's health that we can hope for something like mental or emotional clarity. And the experience of the South makes this all clear in his consciousness. Nietzsche writes in an unpublished note, quote, "At St. Petersburg I should be a nihilist. Here I believe in the sun, instinctively, as does a plant," end quote. And Zweig doesn't put it like this, but I had the thought reading through this section of the work that, Goethe goes down to Italy and Sicily to study plants. Nietzsche goes down there to be a plant. I'd like to bring up one final point of comparison between Nietzsche and Goethe that Zweig draws out, and that is Nietzsche's musical writing style. The fact that he becomes enamored with music and tries to bring musicality into philosophy. From the very beginning of his philosophical career, in the very first book he publishes, this flight into music is explicit. Zweig says that even though Birth of Tragedy was subtitled Out of the Spirit of Music, the book it should have been reversed, right? It really should have been called The Birth of Music Out of the Spirit of Tragedy. What he means by this is that Nietzsche uses tragedy as a basis or as an inspiring idea in order to write musically. Not in the style most congenial to those who wished for philological scruples and for academic rigor, but he wanted to create a style that flows out into lyricism, and he structures the work like a symphony that rises and falls and culminates to a dramatic explosion before the action declines and glides towards a finish. Nietzsche was criticized for this book precisely because it was more musical than erudite. And it was dedicated to Wagner and attempted to render his music in the form of philosophy. This approach leads to numerous flaws in the work, places where Nietzsche's scholarship was called into question, or where the logic of the book is filled in by Schopenhauer's ideas or even by what you could call flights of philosophical fancy. But this is not by any means the end of Nietzsche's entanglement with music throughout his philosophical career. Thus spoke Zarathustra, he tells us, is written, quote, "in the spirit of the first phase of the Ninth Symphony," end quote. All the way up until the end of his career, he pens repeated aphorisms on the importance of music. Without music, life would be a mistake. In music, the passions enjoy themselves. Nietzsche's work on Wagner is informative as well, and his turn against Wagner. Nietzsche put together no fewer than 3 different books on Wagner, and his comments on Wagner are not limited to those works, but he was certainly very concerned with the problem of Wagner, the case of Wagner, as he calls it, and first and foremost because of what Wagner has done to music. Nietzsche's love of Wagner begins with music. His criticism of Wagner also is nested in his understanding of Wagner's music. The concerns over Wagner's social and political movement, or his moral philosophy, or even his metaphysical philosophy, his turn towards Christianity as Nietzsche saw it. This is all a secondary concern. Wagner, as a musician, as a composer, has a real power, and this power can be used in a way to enliven Europe and Germany, make them healthier, or it can be used to make them sicker. So his dialectic of sickness and health enters here. But those expressions of sickness and health happen in the medium of music. The music is the key concern. Indeed, Nietzsche writes, quote, "Was a man ever so athirst for music as I?" end quote. If Spinoza was the God-intoxicated man, Nietzsche was the musically intoxicated man. As early as that first book, Dionysus is associated with the power of music, and all the way through to his final work, Dionysus is a central concept. And Nietzsche's conception of Dionysus changes and develops, but it never loses that connection to music. Nietzsche has that inkling from the very beginning of his career that music itself could be the bleeding edge of a revaluation of values, that music itself can give rise to religions, moralities, social conditions. It's a really radical idea. It's one that's actually approximated by Socrates, or maybe even fully shared by Socrates if you read dialogues such as The Republic or Ion. The difference is that Socrates would like to regulate and control music and poetry because of this, because its power makes it dangerous, and we should only direct and shape the values of society according to reason, not by means of the affects or the passions, which or the stuff of music. But Nietzsche wishes instead to liberate music, let music really express its true power, and thus to reawaken the Dionysian within the listener. When it comes to Goethe, he admitted that he held a cautious attitude towards music. So again, just like with the comparison between the two as regards the experience of the South, Goethe experiences it, finds what he's looking for in it, and gains something aesthetic from it, but ultimately his persona, his identity, holds fast against it. But Nietzsche gives himself up to its power, and so too with music. Goethe keeps the power of music at a distance because he knows that he has been affected by it when he was at his most vulnerable. Quote, music is prone to invade with cataclysmic force the souls of those who have been enfeebled by a recent spiritual earthquake, who have been subjected to violent tensions and rent in sunder by some terrible trial. Tolstoy had the experience, and for Goethe the same experience spelt tragedy. True, Goethe kept a watchful eye upon music. It disquieted him and made him reserved, as did everything that smacked of the demon, and in each of his metamorphoses he recognized that the tempter lay ambushed somewhere, ready to pounce. Nevertheless, for all his precautions, Goethe succumbed to music's charms in moments of relaxation, when he was off guard, when his whole being was in a state of upheaval and on that account weak and accessible. On each occasion, the last being when he fell in love with Ulrike, when he was prey to his emotions, when he was no longer master of himself, music burst through the strongest dam, drew tears from his eyes as tribute, and as a thank-offering a poem whose music was more enchanting than anything he had composed before. End quote. Upon the loss of Nietzsche's mind, music was perhaps the only thing of his personality that really remained. In the final chapters, Zweig describes Nietzsche's last year of creative activity. This explosion of writing came alongside a kind of euphoria, a kind of intoxicated happiness, even as Nietzsche's solitude had deepened. Nietzsche walked the thronging streets of Turin, but was far from the world of those around him. At night he danced wildly in his barren room, stripped of all decorations, so that it would look more like a temple. When he wrote, his pen danced across the page, spilling forth genius from the muse that came almost without effort. In the style of a religious revelation, his Antichrist declared that a new calendar had been set, that time should henceforth be calculated from the date of its writing. Nietzsche began to dance between different personalities. They had become only so many masks, which he could now pick up, wear, and discard at will. Now he was Dionysus himself, now the crucified, now Caesar. Now he was ordering Bismarck's execution, censuring the Pope, expelling the anti-Semites. As easy as it is to dismiss Nietzsche's euphoria as a symptom of madness, as a precursor to the disintegration of his personality, the beginning of his life as an invalid, and thus to dismiss the philosophy written during this time as well, one might think back to the Socratic dialogue with Phaedrus, or another dialogue I just mentioned, the Ion, in which Socrates describes what it means to be artistically inspired. He says it is like being possessed by the power of the muse. The words of the poet are not his own. The poet is like the Pythia, or a Corybantian reveler, who has gone out of his mind and let the god speak through him. We no longer tend to believe in such things, but the language of divine inspiration is precisely the language that Nietzsche uses when writing of his experience in bringing forth his ideas. I'm going to quote from this note in abridged form. Nietzsche writes, quote, "However little superstition remains in one's mind, one hardly finds it possible to repudiate the idea of becoming the mere incarnation, the mere mouthpiece, the mere instrument of supremely powerful forces. The term revelation, in the sense that suddenly, with indescribable certainty and refinement, something becomes visible, audible, something that moves one profoundly and overwhelms one, is but a bald description of the facts. A thought would come to me like a lightning flash, determined in its form, unhesitatingly acceptable. I seemed to have no choice in the matter, a rapture, whose intensity sometimes culminated in a storm of tears, a rapture in which one may involuntarily hasten at top speed for a while, and then suddenly go dead slow, a complete release from the sense of personal identity to the accompaniment of the most distinct awareness of numberless fine bodily thrills extending to the tips of the toes. All happens in the highest degree involuntarily, but to the accompaniment of a stormy conviction of freedom, of unconditionedness, of divine strength. One no longer has any idea of what is image or what is parable. Everything presents itself as the most immediate, the most accurate, the simplest expression, end quote. He then quotes from Zarathustra, quote, "Here come all things caressively at your summons, ingratiatingly, for they want to ride on your back. Here on every metaphor you ride to every truth. Here the words and word cupboards of all being spring open to you. All being wants here to become word. All becoming wants to learn speech from you," end quote. Nietzsche concludes, quote, "Such is my own experience of inspiration. I doubt not that I should have to go back thousands of years to find anyone who would say to me, 'It is also mine,'" end quote. So, in the modern age, we don't have the idea of inspiration as spirit possession, but I think it's a curious fact that most artists, most genuine artists, would acknowledge that this is pretty close to what we can say about the origin of artistic ideas. They seem to come out of the ether. And whether they actually do come from a god or a muse, it is quite like Nietzsche describes it when I feel inspired. It comes naturally, and the productivity actually just hastens along. The more you let go of yourself and let go of your rationality and your ideas, just let the force of inspiration do its work. You surrender to something beyond yourself, and somehow this is the way leading to the greatest creativity. Or at least it is one way, perhaps a dangerous way depending on how susceptible you are to your demon. Because this is unmistakably, Nietzsche is describing the daemonic as Goethe calls it, and the simple surrender to it. He tells us outright, "In my final productive year, in which I write 5 books and produce multiple great works of world literature, it wasn't even me. I was the mouthpiece, the instrument." When Nietzsche finally dances his way into the abyss and untethers himself entirely from his conscious persona, from his sense of self, music is one of the only things remaining. He would still go and play the piano. From the time when he was a young man, Nietzsche loved to improvise on the piano. Apparently this was true of his father also. It may have been one of the things that endeared Nietzsche's mother to his father, that he would just sit down and play improvisations on the piano, play what he felt. And when Nietzsche lost his mind and could no longer carry on a normal conversation and no longer seemed to know who he was or where he was or what year it was, music still played through him. I will now read from the concluding paragraph of Zweig's literary portrait of Nietzsche and what he thinks is the ultimate significance of Nietzsche's life. Quote, "Freedom is Nietzsche's ultimate significance, is the meaning of his life and the meaning of his overthrow. Just as in the domain of natural forces, there is need at times for whirlwinds, wherein the excess of energy rises in revolt against stability, so likewise now and again in the realm of mind is there need for a demonic being, whose transcendent powers shall make him the spearhead of a revolt against the triviality of habitual thought and the monotonousness of conventional morality. There is need of a man who will embody the forces of destruction and who will destroy himself likewise. But these heroic disturbers of the peace are sculptors of the universe no less than are those whose creative work is done silently and without the raising of a riot. These latter, doubtless, manifest the plenitude of life, but the destroyers show its immensity. It is through a study of tragical natures that we become aware of the profundity of feeling. Only because there are some whom no yardstick can measure do the rest of us realize our own possibilities of greatness." End quote. Stefan Zweig puts it better than I ever could. But notice the comparison once again. Goethe is the man who does his creative work without raising a riot. He doesn't mention Goethe by name, but it's rather obvious. Nietzsche is the destroyer who nevertheless helps to sculpt the universe. Goethe shows us the plenitude of life. Nietzsche shows us the intensity of life. These are two images of living, two possibilities. They seem to point us in different directions, but ultimately they have to do with how the artist confronts and comes to terms with the demon within. Before we conclude this episode, and thus conclude the whole series on the demonic, I want to go back to an earlier part of Zweig's book, where he discusses an anecdote from Nietzsche's time at Basel. And Zweig playfully presents this as though it were a kind of inciting incident in setting Nietzsche's course in life. I say playfully because, one can only really believe what Zweig says here if they actually believe in daemones, in the existence of these supernatural spirits, who serve as intercessors between man and the divine, or between the finite beings and the limitless, the infinite, the impossibilities of all that which lies beyond reason and the understanding of mankind. Quote, "Hail, demons! It was with this presumptuous cry that one fine night Nietzsche and his friends defied the powers. At that mystic hour when the spirits are abroad, they poured red wine from their brimming glasses into a sleeping street of Basel as a libation to the unseen. A fanciful joke such as students love, but containing a prophetical warning nevertheless. For the demons, likely as not, hear the summons and may dog the footsteps of him who throws down the gauntlet. Nietzsche never tried to evade the demands of the monster whose grip he felt." End quote. So, just as the Hellenic pagans of old would pour out libations to the daemones, the protective spirits of the land who dwelt in the Greek cities, Nietzsche and his friends also do so. It is doubtful that Nietzsche really believed in pagan religiosity. I would follow Zweig in saying that this seems like the general shenanigans that students get into, a kind of joke. And especially among students of the classics, they love these kinds of inside jokes, playing along with past rituals and traditions. But Nietzsche is the kind of man who gives himself up to these mysterious powers, rather than the type who attempts to hold fast against them. Whether the source of his inspiration is simply his own psychological inner world, or whether it is some kind of inspiration brought about by an impersonal Goethean account of the demonic, or whether Nietzsche and his friends really did summon the daimones, who thereafter worked through Nietzsche as though he were their mouthpiece. Nietzsche knows only at the end of his career that a power greater than himself worked through him. He dances along to its music. If his drives take him up to the highest heavens, he joyously soars along the course that they set. If the fire blazes and makes his passion spill forth as ink onto the page, so be it. And if the demonic fire burns out of control and threatens to immolate Nietzsche, to burn away his ties to other human beings, to burn his masks of self-identity, burn the roots tying him to his native country, so much the better. Let the fire burn freely. Let it burn away everything that ties me down. Let it burn away everything that could be an obstacle to my freedom. In the end, there is only the fire, and Nietzsche offers himself as a sacrifice to it. As Nietzsche writes in an unpublished note, quote, "Fire and consummation, this is what our entire life must be, O you windbags of truth, and the vapor and incense of the sacrifices will live longer than the victims." End quote. So concludes our exploration of the daemonic, everyone. The idea for this series really fascinated me. It led me into all sorts of avenues that I didn't think I would explore. I've read from the works of many writers over the past number of months, like Herder and Jacobi and Lessing, who I never would have thought to read had Goethe's Spinozistic ideas not pointed me in their direction. In other words, I was just sort of, I was led along by an inspiration in making these episodes. Perhaps I have a bit of the demonic in me. I guess that's all an artist can really hope for, right? And so until next time, commit your lives to the fire. That is, if you dare. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.